Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the matter of authorship of the Gospel of John. In my book, The Eye of the Beholder, I have two full sections on that. I have a chapter and then an appendix on that question. Today what I'm going to be doing is adding the authorship or the eyewitness testimony to the Gospel of John to the list of things where I want to warn you about something. It's a big theme of my work, unfortunately, something I wish I didn't have to do, to warn people not to accept uncritically statements about what the majority of scholars grant. It has become endemic throughout evangelical scholarship and especially evangelical apologetics to make overstatements very enthusiastically often about what the majority of liberal scholars grant, what the majority of critical scholars grant, and so forth, on point after point, often in the context of arguing for the resurrection of Jesus, and in that way to suggest that we can get these really surprising results from using just what the majority of critical scholars grant. So we don't need to go up against the majority of critical scholars at an early point in our apologetic arguments. We can sort of launch with some kind of surprising admission that the majority of critical scholars make, maybe without realizing how important that admission is, and then that we as Christians can kind of point out the almost inevitable argumentative impact of that which these critical scholars evidently didn't notice or didn't realize, and then they're just sort of not going to the logical conclusion of what they themselves granted. And I think in almost all cases, this is wrong. Critical scholars may be wacky, but they're not stupid. When they grant something with the right hand, they pretty much inevitably take it away with the left. So there's this tendency to say, grant that the beloved disciple lies somewhere behind the fourth gospel, very far behind. And then that's the point. You take that away by saying, well, he only lies very far behind. And I'll be talking about that today. So, except for the existence of Jesus, where I think there is genuine common ground, just that Jesus existed, between conservative and liberal scholars, in general, when you hear someone say, well, the majority of critical scholars surprisingly grant, or the majority of critical scholars grant, and throw something out there, you think to yourself, wow, I didn't know that. That's kind of amazing. A question mark should appear in your mind. It's probably not as amazing as it sounds. It's probably not as helpful as it sounds. And we should just be prepared to argue against what the majority of critical scholars think from a very early point in our argument. So I want to talk about that with authorship today. And I want to thank Eric Manning. He's helping me with intersplicing some clips. That's not something I know how to do. It's not something I usually do. I'm going to do one clip this time and then some clips next time on this issue of authorship. So let's go ahead and run that clip of Michael Licona on Potential Theist recently.
The majority of critical scholars today that write on the topic of prolegomena related to Mark say that the traditional authorship of Mark is correct and that Mark's primary source for his gospel was Peter. The majority of critical scholars writing on the topic today, they do not agree with the traditional authorship of the Gospel of John. Nevertheless, they still think that the Gospel of John was either written by a minor disciple of Jesus who had traveled with him, or that the author, whoever it was, used as his primary source one of Jesus' disciples, perhaps even John, the son of Zebedee. Dale Allison himself believes that latter one. So you have eyewitness testimony that's carefully rooted, at least in Mark and in John. And these talk about the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So here's my point. If you have the Jerusalem apostles who are saying Jesus rose bodily from the dead, Paul saying Jesus rose bodily, physically from the dead, then when they are appealing to these sources, these eyewitnesses who had seen the risen Jesus, it's not much of a jump to infer that these appearances were bodily in nature. They led to the conclusion that Jesus had been raised physically, bodily from the dead.
Okay, so you heard that clip. I'm going to talk about the Markan authorship aspect later, not today. But you heard this statement that even though the majority of critical scholars don't grant the traditional authorship of the Gospel of John, they nonetheless grant that it was at least used as a primary source. That is to say, one of Jesus' own personal disciples was used as a primary source for the gospel, and he attributes this view to Dale Allison, and then emphasizes that they talk about the bodily resurrection. So the idea is supposed to be that since a personal disciple of Jesus was at least a primary source for the Gospel of John, the fourth Gospel, and since he talks about the bodily resurrection, this is helpful to the argument for the bodily resurrection, significantly helpful. That's the impression you would get from that, and that even Dale Allison grants this. Now, there's an irony here I want to state right at the beginning, and then I'll move beyond it, but it's something that you just need to know in case you haven't followed my earlier work. Dr. Licona himself is one of those people who grants something with the right hand and takes it away with the left. That is to say, he himself is opposed to the idea that the Gospel of John is historical reportage, my reportage model. He himself thinks that the author of the fourth Gospel attributed things to Jesus that historically Jesus never recognizably said. He'll sometimes use the word paraphrase for this, but that's very confusing. For example, the saying, "I thirst," on the cross. He agrees with Daniel Wallace that this was something that the author was just sort of inspired by the saying, very different saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And then made it look like Jesus historically said, "I thirst," on the cross, when he didn't even say, water, give me some water or something at that point. To call that paraphrase just muddies the water. It's a straight up invention. And other things, changing the day of the crucifixion, changing the year of the temple cleansing, inventing Jesus breathing on his disciples and saying, "Receive the Holy Ghost," thing after thing after thing, where Dr. Licona is basically saying the fourth gospel is very challenging, and we need to recognize that, and it's not in the genre of straightforward reportage. And you can find documentation of all of this in my books, The Mirror or the Mask and The Eye of the Beholder. So for him now, at this point, to be bringing up traditional authorship to support the bodily resurrection of Jesus is just confusing. He even suggested in 2020 that John, the son of Zebedee, had a so-called secretary working for him who introduced these factual changes because the secretary was supposedly trained in Greek literature. I'm going to assume that was supposedly done with the approval of John, the son of Zebedee, but either way, it's really removing a lot of the impact of so-called traditional authorship upon actual historical reliability. But I want to move beyond that now to what he says about Dale Allison. And I want to read you a couple quotations from Dale Allison's 2021 book on, and these quotations concern the authorship of the fourth gospel and its reliability. This book by Allison is about the resurrection. So here we go. According to William Lane Craig, quote, this is me quoting Allison, quoting Craig, behind the Johannine account stands the witness of the beloved disciple, one of the 12, which serves as a guarantee of the fundamental accuracy of the traditions of the event, end quote from Craig. So here's Dr. Craig trying to make use of the witness of the beloved disciple in pretty much the same way that Dr. Licona is doing. And Allison is having none of it. Continuing with the Allison quote, this is far too easy. 1. While I agree with Craig that the beloved disciple was a historical figure, his authorship of John is not a given, cf. 21:24. 2. If the beloved disciple was not the author, we do not know to what extent the gospel reproduces his direct testimony. This is on page 62, footnote 119. So, to begin with, he says, it's by no means a given that the beloved disciple has a witness that stands behind this in some way that's helpful to historical reliability. And he thinks the beloved disciple existed as a real person, but, whoopee, but that we really just can't tell to what extent his testimony has been basically overlaid by other alterations. Even more directly, on page 68, footnote 166, Allison says, while the so-called beloved disciple was, in my view, a historical figure who played an important role in the history of Johannine Christianity, and while I think we should identify him with John the son of Zebedee, I do not share Blomberg's confidence in the general historicity of the fourth gospel. Okay, so here we get maybe where Dr. Licona gets the idea that Dale Allison thinks that the testimony of the beloved disciple who was the son of Zebedee lies behind the book. Again, as I said earlier, very far behind. Allison is explicit that he doesn't agree with Craig Blomberg. Craig Blomberg has, of course, argued very well for the historicity of the fourth gospel, but that he doesn't agree with him about that, even about the general historicity of the fourth gospel. That's about as explicit as you can get. Moreover, on page 64, when we're talking about the resurrection, how this impacts arguments for the resurrection. I'm not going to read that in the interest of time. You can look it up in Allison's 2021 book on page 64. He's explicit as can be that the Doubting Thomas story is invented. It is an invention. It didn't happen. Okay. So again, we want to talk about the bodily resurrection. That's one of the strongest arguments for the bodily resurrection. There's Thomas, being invited to look at Jesus' wounds. It's very common for Allison to take anything that can have apologetic import for the bodily resurrection and to deny the historicity of that aspect of the story. That's just what Allison does. Okay, so completely to co-opt Allison, of all people, as acknowledging that the testimony of John the son of Zebedee lies behind the gospel in some way that's supposed to be helpful to the argument for the resurrection, goes completely contrary to what Allison himself says in his most recent book on the resurrection. Okay. Now, I want to talk about what Richard Bauckham tells us about the state of scholarship. Richard Bauckham, I think, has a much better appreciation of the actual state of critical scholarship concerning the authorship of the fourth gospel, the testimony of the beloved disciple, and where it stands there. And Bauckham sees himself as going up against critical scholarship on this very issue. This takes off from the reference to John 21:24, which I deliberately read as part of that passage from Dale Allison. What's the deal there? In brief, this is the deal. John 21:24 says that this is, and it's referring back to the beloved disciple who's been there, right there in the previous couple verses, the disciple who wrote these things. And we know that his testimony is true. Now, it's one of the great ironies of Johannine scholarship that a verse that was obviously specifically intended to secure the historical reliability of the Gospel of John, because the beloved disciple wrote it, has been taken by scholars, including apparently Dale Allison, to mean exactly the opposite. And what these scholars do is that the mere fact that that verse gives the impression of maybe being added by another hand or another voice commenting on these things, means that the whole gospel was written or significantly edited and changed by the Johannine community, which is the voice that we hear in 21:24, which pushes the influence of the beloved disciple back further away from the content of the book as we have it. Now, that's what I call an anti-standard. It's one of these just perverse, weird things that happens in scholarship when they flip things on their head. You know, it's like C.H. Dodd saying that the more vivid details and specific details there are in an account of Jesus' resurrection, the more probable it is that somebody made it up. So this is similar. You know, here's this verse that says, the beloved disciple wrote this book, and we know that its testimony is true. Oh, see? The beloved disciple just kind of stands behind it. You know, very weird. Now, Richard Bauckham's all over this. I'm not saying I agree with everything Richard Bauckham thinks, but when it comes to the connection of the beloved disciple, he's on a roll, but he recognizes that he's not in touch with the majority of critical scholars today that write on the topic. Okay, exactly the opposite of what Licona says. And so, to explain the nuance here, Bauckham is talking about the tendency to take 21:24 to refer to the whole gospel, but then to try to reinterpret the word graphein, which is the word for wrote, that he wrote it, and reinterpret that to mean just that he took spiritual responsibility, or that he's at some unspecified distance far behind it. So these are some of the best pages in Bauckham. I'm just going to read some quotes from them. And it turns out that I did not write down the page numbers in Bauckham. I apologize for that, and I will put that in the show notes. Okay. Here's Richard Bauckham. The disciple in question is the disciple who appears as an anonymous figure at key points in the Gospel's narrative, usually described as the disciple Jesus loved. Taken at face value, this conclusion to the Gospel seems to claim that this disciple wrote it. This was the traditional understanding of the words until the modern period. But most modern scholars have been reluctant to accept this claim. One rather popular way, so notice most modern scholars, popular way, of evading it has been the suggestion that verse 24 does not really claim that the beloved disciple was the author of the gospel. The language used need not mean actual authorship, but may point to a rather less direct relationship between the beloved disciple and the gospel. Okay, and then a little bit later, many scholars have taken the evidence that graphein could refer to writing by dictation as a warrant for interpreting John 21:24 as attributing to the beloved disciple a relationship to the gospel considerably less direct than Pilate's to the inscription on the cross, or Paul's to his letters. Now he quotes a scholar named Schenck, and I'm going to skip that quote and go on with Bauckham. Somehow Schenck finds it possible to move from the incontrovertible fact that graphein can refer to dictation to claiming it would be difficult to press the formula to mean more than that the beloved disciple had, quote-unquote, spiritual responsibility for what is contained in the book, unquote. Bauckham says not a single example is given of the use of graphene to assert no more than spiritual responsibility for the content of a book. What is even more remarkable is the way in which this staggeringly faulty piece of argument has been uncritically followed by scholar after scholar. And then he refers to Raymond Brown. So this is really Bauckham on a roll. This is my favorite passage in the book. Continuing, it must be stressed that no one has yet produced any evidence that graphene can be used to refer to a relationship between author and text more remote than that of the dictation of a text to a scribe. No one seems even to have looked for such evidence. Yet the notion that John 21:24 asserts no more than that the beloved disciples witnessed lies somewhere at the source of the tradition that later, in other very creative hands, produced the gospel has become common. Scholar after scholar has evidently found it sufficient that previous Johannine scholars have found this view credible despite the lack of linguistic evidence. This must be because they have found it so hugely improbable that the beloved disciple could himself be the author of the gospel that they have grasped like a dying man at the straw of possibility that 21:24 does not say that he was. Now, I love those passages because of Bauckham using phrases like staggeringly faulty and so forth, that if I used them, I would hear all about my bad tone. But also for this purpose, for the purpose of this video, the way that indicates that the majority of critical scholars do not think that the witness of the beloved disciple is the primary source for the gospel in such a sense as to make its statements about Jesus' resurrection historically credible or likely to be what the original witnesses actually claimed, that they had these experiences and so forth, these specific experiences. It's far more common to take a position like that of Dale Allison. Now, I would say Dale Allison's position is typical and fits extremely well with what Bauckham says, that, there was this real guy, he was the beloved disciple, maybe he was even John the son of Zebedee, and maybe his witness lies somewhere way at the back of the line of descent that in creative hands, resulted in this gospel, but the Doubting Thomas story was made up. Okay, the statements of Jesus being able to eat were made up, and so forth. So this just confirms what I'm telling you. Unfortunately, whenever you hear someone saying, well, the majority of critical scholars grant, and then they say something really surprising, like, wow, the beloved disciple is the witness that lies behind his testimony lies behind the fourth gospel. Have a little ding, 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 ding that goes on in your mind saying, what does lies behind, or what does primary source mean? Do they really grant anything that exciting? And so forth. Because, like Bauckham, all of us out here who take a position ultimately that's much more quote-unquote conservative than that of the majority of scholars need to recognize that that's probably not just because they go with us up until almost the end and then they kind of go off in a different direction. It's usually because at some earlier point in the argument they've sort of insulated themselves from admitting something that would really lead to any very conservative conclusion. And that's definitely what's happened in the case here of the relationship of the beloved disciple to the Gospel of John. Okay, next time I'm going to be talking about Dr. Licona's rather surprising statement here, specifically about the authorship of Mark, and that the majority of critical scholars writing today, how does he put this, say that the traditional authorship of Mark is correct and that Mark's primary source for his gospel was Peter. And I'm going to be looking into that because that's in some ways even more surprising and is not in fact supported by the evidence. This is not to try to discourage you. This is to try to, if you are a Christian, and if you are a skeptic, this is not to try to tell you that the evidence is on your side. Instead, it's to try to tell everybody that the majority of critical scholars are wrong, and that that can be shown evidentially, and that the only way we're going to really well prepare ourselves to show that is to admit that we need to show that. Okay, come back next time to the Lydia Magruder channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.